So I've got all my pieces cut out and I left the freezer paper on. You're going to leave it on this whole time. Try and leave it on as you sew and everything. I have here, you know, remember I was talking about like this is like a puzzle. This is the puzzle box. So I want to keep this out to refer for reference of where my pieces go. I also arranged everything in the right order. It's not all going to fit together correctly because of all the added seam allowance that we have there, but just get it in the right place. Now, the rule here when you're sewing these pieces together is that you want to sew short seams first and then try and connect that to a larger piece with a larger seam. So, for example, I'm going to sew E and 8 together first, and I'm going to sew D and 6 together, and then I can attach this piece to 7 and attach this piece to 7. I do C and 5, attach it to 4, B and 3, attach it to 4 here. And those are my big sections that I drew out with the yellow marker. So I'll have this section done and I'll have this section done. Then for this one I'm going to do 9 and A together, 2 and A together, and that will give me one long seam, one long piece here, so I can do this seam with 1 right there. And then finally, when those 3 sections are all done, then I can use my thin pieces and just attach those. I'll attach this to the long, to this section here, and then I'll attach another piece to this section, and then I'll sew those all together. That's the process. If you've ever sewn with angles before, you know that there's seam allowance. There's little pieces that are going to stick out the corners, and if you try and line up your edges, then this end is going to stick out. So what you're going to have is little corners that stick out, and depending on the angles that you're sewing together, it's going to be different. So I have a little trick to make sure that I sew these together. When I put the right sides together, I use a pin. And what I do is I take the pin and I put it through the top corner of the fabric, and then I find the other piece and stick it through the right side so that it comes out right at the top corner of the other piece, and then use that pin as an axis, bring those 2 pieces together and line up that edge. And then when I sew along that edge there with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I open it up, then those edges will be aligned right there. Alright, I'm at my sewing machine now. I have my I have a 1/4 inch presser foot attached here. If you have one of those, that works great. You don't have to have it, because mostly what you should be doing is following the edge of your freezer paper, and that will give you a nice precise 1/4 inch seam. But try not to sew through the freezer paper, because it really gets stuck, and then if you have to pull it off, it doesn't tear very easily, and it can actually rip your seams if you do that. So try and sew right to the very right of it, and right up next to it. And I'll just sew this seam, and you don't have to back stitch at the front or at the end, because all your pieces are kind of going to overlap. Leave a little tail there, and then I'm going to go over here to my iron, and I want to have my seam open. I'm going to finger press it first and then just hit it with the iron. Trim off these little tails and the corners that are poking out. There we go. So all your pieces should look like that. Maybe not as stringy as that one, but continue to sew those sections together, and I'll put that right back there so that I don't lose track of what I'm doing now. Sew these 2 together. Well, I finished my 3 sections, and I pressed them, made sure they're all flat. I lost a piece of freezer paper there, but that's okay. Now, my next step is to sew in these what I call sashing, but they represent the fold lines on the origami animal. These long, thin strips that we cut that were 5/8 of an inch, it's going to go right in there and there. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to, the last seam that I need to do on here is this long one, because if I did, this one is my last one, I'd have to do a Y seam. Avoiding Y seams at all costs. So I'm going to do this one first, and then I'll do that one. So my what I need to do is just sew this strip to this piece. 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Okay, so deep back stitch. And notice that I didn't measure that piece because I knew that if it was just a little bit longer than my section piece, then I can just trim this up. I'll just cut it like this actually, because I need to go. Now when I iron this piece, if I were to press this seam open, that would actually get in the way of my next seam because I only have 1/8 of an inch in between. I've got a 1/4 inch seam on one side, 1/4 inch on the other, and then 1/8 of an inch in between is the actual strip of fabric. So there's just not enough. So on this one you have to press the seam to the side. Back to the side, towards the section we just sewed on. It's a little bit tricky because you've got some paper in there and some bulk from the seams, but just work it with your fingers, and then I go back over, work it on this side. You could take your freezer paper out at this point if you wanted. That might make it a little bit easier. Alright, so that one's done, and now my next step is to sew that to this. Alright, so my final step is going to be taking my other long strip and sewing it to this, and then sewing that to this, and then we'll be all done. So I finished this up. I sewed on this piece here with the little sashing in there, and then I turned it over and took out all my freezer paper and pressed it. Sometimes if you sew through a little bit of freezer paper, you might have to be really careful that you don't rip your stitches there. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed our first Sew Mama Sew sewing video tutorial, and you can use this method. We just did the fish here, but you could do any of the animals from the series. There's 26 from the alphabet. Or you can use the same techniques to draw your own design and do some freezer paper piecing for quilt blocks or pillow blocks, whatever you want to do.